Rabosai, we're here on Daf Peches Amid Beis, and we discussed the following case. And this will lead us to the next Mishnah, the new Mishnah for today. We have a case of an Eved that was owned by two Jews in partnership, and one of the two was Meshachrer, his half of the partnership, and therefore that half becomes a Yisrael, because a get shichur is an act which not only has financial implications, but it also has gerus implications. The gerus of an eved is incomplete, and the completion is with the shichur. Once he gets freed, he becomes a full-fledged Yisrael. But in this case, since only one of the two shutfim freed his ownership on half of the eved, we're left with what we call a chatzi eved, chatzi ben chon. Now the Gemara assumes that this chatzi eved, because he's a chatzi ben chon, it's chayiv in the mitzvah period of a river. Ad kedei kach, that Beit Shammai in the Mishnah Rishona compels the adon of the other half to be meshacher his eved. Because, as we discussed yesterday, great length, this chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin, cannot marry anyone. He can't marry a shivcha because of the chatzi ben chorin. He can't marry a Yisraelis because of the chatzi eved. So we force the Baal of the other half of the eved to give a get shich. Beis Hillel rejected. You can't impose a financial responsibility on the partner who's left based on the fact that never this eved has no way of being a kain period. And then in the Mishnah Achrona, even Beis Hillel went back and they accepted the position of Beit Shammai, Kofin es Rabo. We forced the owner of the eved, again of the other half of the eved, for the sake of the mitzvah of period of Rivya, to be meshacher and release the eved of his chatzi avdus. Now he becomes a full-fledged Jew. Now, how does this impact on minui on a korban pesach? Initially, Beis Hillel rejected Beit Shammai, and the status of this chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin is exactly as it is. It's written in stone. It's not going to change. We have no reason to anticipate that it's going to change. And as such, the chatzi eved shebo prevents him, meaning this half eved, from being mafresh his own korban liatzma, because he's an eved. And an eved is totally under the control and the ownership, the possession of the Rav, or the Adon, as far as korban pesach is concerned. On the other hand, he's a chatzi ben chorin, and as a chatzi ben chorin, his Adon has no right to set up a korban pesach for him. So the Gemara says the following, that if you find a stira in our Mishnah seems to imply that Misha Chetzer Eved Chetzer Ben Chorin Lo Yochal Mishal Rabo, but he can be mafresh his own korban pesach. That's the Mishnah Achrona, when Beis Hillel conceded to the position of Beis Shammai, and now we say that we have a concept called biyado. Biyado means that we assume that something that you have in your control to do is as if you did it already. That's a universal principle of biyado. So, for example, if we trust someone on Hafrash's Trumas and Maisus, it's because of biyado. He could have been mafresh the Trumas and Maisus. We believe him when he says that it's not teva. And many other cases of biyado with a mocher and a lokeach, etc. So here we have an example of biyado, that this eved, who's only a chatzi eved, can achieve, and he's guaranteed to be able to achieve his shichrur, because after the Mishnah Achrona, even Beis Hillel concede that kofin is rav. So although right now when he went ahead, he was mafresh his own korban pesach, he's still a chatzi eved, but nevertheless, we apply the principle biyado, and we consider him as if he was a ben chorin, and he could shech the korban pesach li atzmo. Now, the very premise of this sugya, that an eved is chayav in the midst of period of arivia, chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, is very strange. In other words, we have to be kofetis rabo to guarantee and facilitate the possibility of this chatzi eved ben chorin of fulfilling his mitzvah period of arivia. We got to give him an option of having a girl that he can marry. Why is he chayiv in period of arivia? The mitzvah period of arivia could not apply to an eved because eved ein lo chiyus, he has no yuchsin. Ein beno miyuchas achra. You cannot be mechayiv an eved in period of arivia because the child that he fathers will not be his child. Again, when I say it's not his child, obviously we're not talking biological terms, etc., etc. Genetically, it's his child, but halachically, it's not his child because eved ein lo chiyus, he doesn't have yuchsin. So now you are imposing upon this chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin a chiyuv period of arivia. How's it so? Now, here we could say the following: that when we say that an eved is not chayiv in period of arivia because he has no yuchsin, that's not halach in the gavra; it's halach in the chefta. What do I mean? As a gavra, he's chayiv in all mitzvahs, with the exception of mitzvah seishas man groma. Period of arivia is not a time-bound mitzvah, and therefore even an eved should be chayiv. The reason why he's potter is because of chefta. Meaning chefta means his physical body. You know, as a gavra, as a halachic agent or persona, he is chayiv in the mitzvah period of arivia. It's not his man groma, but he's not chayiv because he cannot fulfill the period of arivia because his chefta is ein lo yichus. However, in a case where he's a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, then the chatzi ben chorin shebo is capable of yichus. As a gavra, he was chayav even as an eved. The only problem is he cannot fulfill that chiyuv because in chefta he's an eved and he has no yichus. There's no yichus. But now that he's a chatzi ben chorin, the chatzi ben chorin shebo allows him in chefta to have a child that's miyuchas achra. So mimonavsha, v'toras chovas gavra, even as an eved he was chayav. V'toras chefta, as far as the chatzi eved shebo, that prevents him from yichus. But now that he has a chatzi ben chorin shebo, the chatzi ben chorin shebo will give the child a yichus to its father via the channel of the chatzi ben chorin shebo. Hence, he's chayiv in period of arivia. However, it's interesting when you read the Gemara carefully. The Gemara invokes a pasuk in Yeshayahu and Novi. Does everybody see that on Daf Peiches Amud Beis? If you count down from the top of the Amud, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top, the pasuk says, "Shenemar lo sohu bra lo sheves yitzara." God did not create the earth to be desolate, but rather to be populous. Why does the Gemara quote the pasuk in Yeshayahu? Open up to Sefer Bereshis, Perek Tes, and it says Puravu. That's the source for the mitzvah of procreation. The Gemara seems to be playing, dancing a very thin tightrope here. On the one hand, it says, "Halo lo nivra olam el period of arivia," and you get the impression that the Gemara is assuming that this chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin has a chiyuv and a mitzvah which he cannot fulfill, and therefore we're going to compel his adon to give him a get shichrur to facilitate his ability to keep him in kind of mitzvah. And we're talking about period of review, but then it says shenemar, and then we get to lo sobra. Now, generally speaking, in the Sugya and Yevamis of period of review, this pasuk in Yirmiyahu, in Yeshayahu, is quoted for a person who already has whatever he has to have in order to fulfill the mitzvah period of review, lamazagin, a boy and a girl. And after he has a boy and a girl, he raises his hands and he says, I was Makai in the mitzvah period, I'm no longer obligated. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk in Yirmiyah, in Yeshayahu, lo sobra, to establish a chiyuv that takes him throughout his life to have children, even though he's fulfilled the mitzvah period. But that's not the mitzvah period of Rivya. That's an additional mitzvah of lo sobra. Now, if this is correct, we can draw a very far-reaching conclusion that the Gemara never said and never assumed that a Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chorin is chayiv in the mitzvah period of Rivya, but rather lo tov bra. This pasuk lo tov bra could have an impact even on non-Jews. When the Navi Yeshayahu, I got to write this down, Yeshayahu addresses the people, and he says that God did not want this earth to be desolate, but rather he wanted it to be populated. Yeshayahu is not addressing just Klal Yisrael, he's addressing the entire world. Even a Ben Noach, which means that a Ben Noach, although he doesn't have the obligation of period of Rivya, he does have the obligation of Lo Sobra to populate the world, which is an extension of period of Rivya, but stands on its own. Therefore, it's very possible that a Chatzi Ben Chorin is, although obligated in the mitzvah Lo Sobra, but he's exempt from the mitzvah period of Rivya, which might mean that an Eved, as a Gavra, is potter from the mitzvah period of Rivya. It's not just a problem in the Chefza that he cannot have a Ben HaMiyuchas Achrav, like we said before, because an Eved doesn't have Yuchsin, but it goes beyond that. He's not a Gavra who's chayiv in period of Rivya. In other words, what we're saying is that the mitzvah period of Rivya was only given, it was only imposed upon those who have Yuchsin. And he who is not part of Yuchsin is not included in period of Rivya. But the Gemara says he would be no worse than a guy who's obligated the mitzvah Lo Sobra. And we're going to compel his Adon to deliver a get shikra and free his half in order to facilitate that mitzvah, not the mitzvah of period of Rivya, but the mitzvah of Lo Sobra. All right, this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Peiches Amud Beis. What's the deal with a shliach? I can send a shliach to be my proxy, my agent, and be mafresh a carbon for me, a carbon Pesach in this particular case. But you know what? A carbon Pesach has two options. Is what's called a gedi and what's called a tleh, a lamb and a kid, a young goat, lashnosa. If the Mishaleach is interested in eating a gedi, he's a goat man and not a lamb man, then if the shliach went ahead and he was mafresh a tleh instead of a gedi, that's going to be a problem. Because we have a principle called shliach sheshina shlichuso, that if a shliach deviates from the commission that he was given, it's not a valid shlichus. Now we get to a more complicated question. What happens if the Mishaleach doesn't indicate one iota of preference for either a tleh or a gedi? So the Mishnah says, he gives him a general, all-encompassing commission. When I say all-encompassing, I mean whether it's a tle or a gdi. V'shachat gdi yochal, shachat tle yochal. If the shliach chose a gedi and he went and he shechted it, that's fine. If he shechted a tle, that's also fine. What happens is, in this case, is that the Mishalech leaves it up to the discretion and decision of the Eved. You know, I always joke about this, but I thought that maybe what the Mishnah means is that let the Eved decide what he's going to eat together with his Adon. Let him decide which meat he likes to eat. And according to the Mishnah, the Mishalech who sent him actually gave him that discretion, that rope, that free territory to decide. It's like when you invite someone for Shabbos and they bring a gift, a bottle of wine. So you don't mind if they bring the wine that they like to drink. And even if it's not your type of wine, you'll open the wine bottle so that the guest can drink from the wine. He brought the wine, let him drink from the wine. And that's okay. However, what happens if the shliach went ahead, and in this case, the shliach was an eved, and he was mafresh 2 korbanos? Presumably, one he wants to eat on his own, and one he wants to dedicate for his master, the Rab. Now, can he be mafresh a korban on his own? That might depend whether he's an Eved Ivri, an Eved Knani. We can get into that, but let's just say theoretically he could be mafresh a korban on his own. And he went ahead and he was mafresh 2 korbanos, one a gdi and one a tle. Which one goes for the Adon and which one goes for the Eved? And the Adon, the Rav, didn't seem to indicate a preference one way or the other. He threw the ball into the court of the Eved and let the Eved make the decision. Now we have to introduce another principle that we spoke about in the last few days, over and over again. At the time of the Shechita, the Korban Pesach, we have to know who is money on the Korban Pesach. And if not, the Shechita is Shalolim Nuya. And now we're in a big mess. Why? Because we don't know which of these 2 species, these 2 animals, whether it's a tle or it's a gdi, will be designated for who. We don't know how to do the match. And the Eved is going to make the decision at some later stage. You know what? I think that my master will prefer gdi milk, meat. He likes goat meat. And he'll make that call. Now we get into the sugya of Brera again. Remember, all the way back, we made a full swing to come back to the old sugya of Brera. Can I decide later and retroactively impact on the Maisa that was done earlier? Can the Eved use his power of discretion to decide that this animal will go to my Rav and this animal will go to me? It'll come up with all sorts as far as why he designates the Gedi for his master or the other way around, the Tle for his master. And these decisions he makes at the time of the Achilas HaPesach. And then you have to introduce the Svara of Brera, that his decision then, at the time of the Achila, which is on the 15th of the month, will impact on the Shechita that took place on the 14th of the month. We don't like that. Because our sugya and the sugya that we learned the other day maintain Ein Brera. We don't apply the principle of Brera. We cannot impact on a Maisa retroactive. And if that be the case, when we read the next part of the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, Shachach, he doesn't remember, Ma Omar Lo Rabba. Now, here's an interesting case that the Mishnah is going to address now. The Rav actually instructed him on which animal should be brought as his Korban Pesach, whether it's a Gedi or a Tle. And the Eved can't seem to remember. He's racking his brains. What did he commission? Did he want a Gedi? Did he want a Tle? We're in deep trouble now. The Mishnah is going to come up with a brilliant answer to this question to solve this problem. But to dramatize the problem, if you don't remember, then you're in a Brera situation, a Brera mode. Why? Because you're going to choose this particular animal for your Adon. The Adon is going to come later on and he's going to tell you got it right or you got it wrong. But it was not definite at the time of the Shechita because Shachach, he didn't remember. So the Mishnah comes up with a solution which is called T'nai. And this is fascinating. Says the Mishnah, Ketzad Yasa, Yishcha Tle Ugdi. He wants to cover his bases. So Mimanavshah, whether the Rav had told him he doesn't remember Gdi or Tle, he checks both of them as a carbon pesach. V'yoma, and he sets up the following T'nai condition. Im Gdi Amali Rebbe is there for Yehei Gdi Shalom. Hatle Yeshali. I'll eat from the Tle. Lamb chops. What's so bad about roasted lamb chops? The Im Tle Amali Rebbe, then Hatle Shalom Gdi Shali. So he has a T'nai which Mimanavshach covers his bases. But the story gets more complicated because the T'nai implies or assumes that the Rebbe didn't forget. I call him the Rebbe, but I mean the master. He didn't forget which one he specified. He likes whatever. He always eats lamb chops. But what happens if the Rav himself forgot which one he wanted, and in his mind, flip a coin, but he doesn't remember. He gave a commission which limits and restricts the authority or the chalos of the Eved as his shliach, but he doesn't remember which one he said. Shachach Rabo, now his master forgot what he said. Both of these karbanos are psulim, and it's considered shalolim nuyah. Why? Because here we not only have shichas ha'eved, we also have shichas ha'rav. Therefore, no one knew at the time of the shechita which one was going for whom. It was an undetermined, undecided shechita, and that's possible. Is Yetzil Beis Hasrei. We don't know which one of these two individuals, the Rav or the Adon, is manui on which one of these two animals. But then the Mishnah hits us with a bomb. I hope, Don, you're listening, because all I see is your beautiful face. So I don't know. It's a flat picture. Upturim milasos Pesach. I would have said the following. What's the difference between all the cases that we had of of a person who contracts tumah, and we push him off from Pesach, reach to Pesach Sheni, and this case of a person who had very good will, wanted to bring a korban Pesach, but it was not a minui. There was no minui because he didn't know at the time of the shechita which group he's part of and which korban he's going to eat, and that undermines the minui. Why not give him an option of Pesach Sheni? Now again, it says Potter Milasos Pesach Sheni. Is that good news or bad news? Meaning, are we working on behalf of the Rav and the Eved, and they're very happy that they don't have to schlep again to Yerushalayim to bring a Pesach Sheni? Or are we robbing them of the kiyum of Pesach, of Korban Pesach? Because they don't have Korban Pesach Rishon, and they don't have Pesach Sheni. And this, my friends, will impact on the case that we had 2 days ago of a married woman who is stuck between a rock and a hard place because she went for the first yontif of her marriage to her father's house, and he invited her to participate in his Korban Pesach. And in the meantime, her husband, her new husband, he had been mafresh Korban Pesach on her behalf in a different location. And she becomes what I call kerech mikan mikan. She's bald on both sides. She lost her white hairs and her black hairs. She doesn't have a Korban Pesach because there was no definite minui to establish her on this, because she may go with her father, she may go with her husband. It's undetermined. We're holding ein breira. Would she be obligated in Pesach Sheni? And here the Mishnah says, "U'turimi Pesach Sheni." Can anybody tell me why what I just said is wrong? That the analogy is not a perfect analogy. That the case of a woman who might be schlepped, she might be pulled by her father, or she might be pulled by her husband, is not equivalent to this case of a tleh and a gdi, and we don't know whether the gdi is for him, meaning for the master, and the tleh is for the eved, or vice versa.
I think in the case of the wife, she didn't give permission to either one, or she didn't acknowledge it. Where in this case, they said they were registered for it, but they just don't know which animal. So they actually intended to have a Korban Pesach.
I want to say even more than that, Don, but you're 100% right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu in heaven knows which korban is kosher for which person. We don't know. He can't eat from the Korban Pesach because maybe he's not money on the Pesach. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that there was a hakrava here with a valid minui. So that when the korban is brought, it is a kiyum, not a full-fledged kiyum, because, again, right now we're saying that the minui is possible, but there was a shechit of a Korban Pesach on behalf of him and him. I can't tell you which Korban Pesach was brought on behalf of him, the tleh or the gdi, or which for him. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows up in Shemayim. So that in this case, what we have is a korban. Again, as far as eating from the korban, that's impossible because you'll never be able to determine. But up in Shemayim, hakrava was on behalf, we don't know which animal, but they know up in Shemayim, right? The Pesach Mala knows. And therefore, potter mi Pesach Sheni. But if you have a case where neither minui can be chal because there's a tug of war between the two different minuis, that of her husband and that of her wife, in such a case, this has nothing to do with Klape Shmaya Galia, what they know up in heaven. This is a contradiction in the minui, in which you have two authorities that are vying for control of the minui, and they're at loggerheads, and as a result, the minui can never be set in stone, and it can never generate a vados, a certainty at the time of the minui, at the time of the shechita, and therefore there was never a korban that was brought on her behalf, because the authority of both of them undermine one the other, but not so in the case of the Eved and the Adon. It's not that they're vying for authority, we just simply don't know. Okay, we don't know, and therefore we cannot allow them to join any minui because it's a suffix. But up in Shemayim, it's absolutely clear that this korban was brought on behalf of him, and this one on behalf of him, and therefore they are parted from Pesach.
But that means that Achila is not Ma'akev.
Say it again?
Does that mean Achila is not Ma'akev in
Correct. That goes back to the whole sugya. I'm not sure which group you're part of, but anyway, in one of our groups that we were money on, we determined that according to Tanoim, Achila is not Ma'akev in the korban. As long as that krova was on behalf of someone, then he was Yotzei the mitzvah krova. He won't be able to eat the korban, but he was Yotzei. In a case of a Tameh, if he was a Tameh at the time of the Shechita, Again, it's complicated if he became Tomei between the Shechita and the Zrika, but if he was Tomei at the time of the Shechita, then he gets sent to Pesach Shein. And that Shechita was not related to a Tomei, unless it's Rovat Tzibur Tmei.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so let's finish the Mishnah. At least we could say we completed the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says, Upturim milasos Pesach Shein. Why? So it says here in the footnote here, based on Rashash's interpretation of Rashi, Mishum sheyotzu yidei chova shchita bezrikas adam shel tle v'gdi, sharei lifnei hayoshev b'shamayim, up in Shamayim, golui mi nimna al kol echad, who, the match. And in the note here on the bottom, he writes, Vehera Rashash, the Rashash adds, She'ein ze el lefi loshon echad b'gemara. She'medubar she'shachach lifnei hazrika. Okay, so that we'll have to see. Hikshu v'tosvus. Madua nokta gemara posuk ze hanemer b'yishayev v'lo nokta posuk piri v'rivi shenem b'torah. That was our question. V'tirtzu b'shlosha tirutz. Okay, so we offered only one teretz, that an Eved is not chayiv in the midst of period of Tosfos offers three answers. Number one, Mishum shemaya yochel lekayim sheves koldu af im lo hayamakayim bozes hamitzvah period kevon sheven en lo yichus. If he would not be Mekayim the mitzvah of Sheves, lo yinu kofim l'shacharo, he says we would not be Meshachar. And why? Because I think he's saying he's not included in period. So the reason why we force his Rav to be Meshachar the Eved is because of the mitzvah of Lo Tov Bra. Number two, Pasuk Zeh, Muchach Shezu mitzvah gedola Yosef. We're only using this pasuk to indicate how great the mitzvah period rivia is. K'mo shalamdu v'gemara b'megillah daf chav zayin mi pasuk zeh sheyesh l'adam limkar sefer Torah k'dei lisa icha. So this pasuk is not really the pasuk that we want to quote. The Gemara only quotes it and brings this pasuk to indicate how important in the scale of mitzvahs period rivi is, because the Gemara Megillah derives from this pasuk that for the sake of period rivi we can sell a sefer Torah. And finally, Gimel mishum lo tov bra shaykh gam b'tzad avdus shalom. Oh, very good, because what we're saying is that even as a ben noach, he would be obligated in the mitzvah of lo tov bra. Ilu period rivi shaykh rak mitzad hacheres shabo. Then he quotes at the end, and with this will complete. He says, "Tosas me bechagiga daf beis amid beis says of Miloshen Gemara halo lo nivra olam ela b'shvil period v'rivya mashma shashelahi mishum mitzvahs period v'rivya." It would seem from we saw also that discrepancy in the language of the Gemara that maybe it's because of period v'rivya. And now he's open to the possibility that there might be a chiyuv period v'rivya in this case because of the chatzi ben chorin. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop for today, and we learned the Mishnah, and now we have to start the Sugya Sagamara Mirza Shem on Yom Rishon. So I wish everyone a great Shabbos Parshas Yisro.